Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
What does /x/ think of the Ural Mountains? The largest individual stone blocks I knew of prior were in Baalbek, coming in at 1,500 tons. However, in the Ural Mountains, we find even larger stones, some weighing in at 3,000 tons. Many are obviously carved, but some of the largest ones, carved and stacked, have become overgrown and are confused for mountains at a distance. There are rumors of artifacts being found in the Ural Mountains, not just ruins, but fairly odd artifacts. Gold artifacts so fine and small they've been dubbed nanostructures. Finally, the Ural Mountains have another odd feature: a large carved sphere from solid stone. Ural is far from the only place where stone spheres can be found, as they've been found in parts of Asia, far eastern and far northeastern Europe, and South America. The Ural Mountains are a site where in the 1950s, 9 would have been 10 had he not gotten sick and left his group to go home, disappeared, and eventually were found dead. This is only noteworthy for it being odd due to the strange orange tans, gray hair, and irradiated clothing of the poor souls that were lost. The orange lights mentioned by the above events are not new to the area, nor are they old, as strange orange lights often light up the skies in the Ural Mountains, often thought to be military testing. So between military testing and some of the largest megaliths in existence, the Ural Mountains have to be one of the more notable weird places in the world. And yet I hardly ever see /x/ talk about them. Why is that?
X thinks that most of these features are natural. Cracks form in layered rock strata like those shown, and often look very similar to human workings, walls, etc. Not unusual. And some of the images shown appear to be concrete blocks. Soviet-era secret stuff, perhaps? Yellowish patches on rocks may indicate uranium-bearing ores, while iron-rich minerals often make compasses act oddly.
Most of them aren't. It's not even /x/ really. The archaeologists that have studied them are mainstream. It's one of the few cases where tinfoil hatters and mainstream archaeology agree on something. They know they aren't natural. The mainstream just gives an honest, we really don't know what the fuck, while the tinfoil hatter's gonna tinfoil hat. The Soviet-era stuff is outright wrong. They've had military in the area, done testing and mining, but the structures in question aren't in anything resembling a style the Soviets would have used, let alone been sensible, as the style is the close-fitting but non-standard stone shapes. It's a style known for various ancient cultures across the world to use. You can see it in South America, for example, but not at all known for any culture local to the Ural Mountains to use. The mining definitely took place, though. There are old mines in the Ural Mountains with very specific structures surrounding them, but they're plainly in a style the Soviets worked in, and, more importantly, there are actual records of them. Hence, the ability to separate out the Soviets are a possibility. You're right that compasses have a hard time in the area, and right about why that probably is. It's why I didn't mention it. It's fairly common. It's especially interesting you brought up concrete, though, as some of the sites are notable as sites where concrete does appear to be present, but with no record of why it would be there. And again, in a style the Soviets simply were not known to use. While it's true there is military testing and military sites in the Urals, none of it matches up with the structures archaeologists struggle with. The sad thing is that because the mainstream archaeologists come to so many, we don't know, and don't bother studying the sites, most of the good photography, unfortunately, is left to the tinfoil hatters, which is why the videos are tinfoil hat videos.
I just spent 2 weeks hiking in the northern Ural Mountains. We informed the government our intent was mostly recreational, but we would also be taking some natural life recordings, tracking how many of certain bird and rodent life could be seen in given areas. We actually traveled to Kholat-Syakhl, leaving our 2 paid sponsors behind in a camp. The closer we got, despite our best efforts to maintain a head of scientific objectivity, it was impossible not to feel some growing disconcert. We were all armed in case of an attack by local wildlife, especially a Eurasian brown bear. They are supposed to be mostly docile and avoid humans, especially in groups, but we argued that in the event of an emergency it would take weeks to get an injured person to any kind of aid, and so we were allowed to carry weaponry. 3 hunting rifles Marlin 1895s, several Tokarev pistols we bought from a local militia guy before leaving, and a Saiga 12. We took enough food, in the form of compacted bread and some other provisions which could be tracked to where we bought them, so I won't be sharing. For water, we mostly just heated snow, although we kept emergency canisters in our packs with 3 days' worth. 5 of us went up there. I'm telling you guys because frankly there's nowhere else I can post this that A, the government won't find it and look into it, and B, I've always trusted that a few people who read this board know what they're doing. We know all about the pass incident. This wasn't a case of idiot hikers stumbling on the area. We went there for a reason. We want to see what happened, where it happened, what we would find and what would happen. I only have a few photos that I took with my phone. Everything else was on our group leader's camera. Here's the answer to those questions in that order. If you haven't heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident, you're on the wrong board. Forget what idiots say. This is one of the most unexplained, unexplainable, best corroborated accounts of paranormal activity there is. It took place in an isolated area that is almost entirely preserved. A military unit sent there documented the whole thing, copied from some website years ago. Team of 9 hikers has to camp there due to bad weather. Something attacks them in the middle of the night. They cut their way out of the tent and flee into the night wearing almost nothing. Some are naked or barely clothed. This is entirely against the logic of anyone who has experienced those weather conditions. They would only do this if they were in immediate danger, or their fight or flight instincts had overridden all reason. These guys were not idiots. Many were experienced hikers. It would be suicide to go up there if you weren't. In order for you to have to cut your way out of the tent, something would have had to be blocking the door, or the door itself would have been unable to open for some reason. They destroyed their only shelter to escape again, a very illogical thing to do. They fled into the night, and when they were found, had a bewildering array of injuries. Radiation poisoning was cited as one, although the validity is debatable. What is obvious is their bodies were abused almost beyond recognition. They had advanced aging, orange skin, extremely violent cuts and lacerations, entire body parts severed, skin removed, faces mangled. Some were described as having sustained injuries similar to that of having been struck by vehicles at high speed. Later on, some of the military personnel claimed to have been followed by orange orbs in the sky. This has been attributed to possible alien involvement. I disagree. You see weird shit all the time at that altitude, and if one guy says he saw it, suddenly everyone thinks they did, years later. Quite a few people have visited the area where it supposedly occurred. Locating the area is easy. There are even signs of where the original team fled to, and the military found them. Old rusted metal poles in the ground lying around where they've fallen over, probably markers for their corpses. The place has actually been visited a few times by some crews, but usually they wind up being chased out by the government when they get close or soon after arrival. The area is very different in winter to what many expect from the Urals. The snow has a tendency to build into banks against the tree lines, forming deep channels. This makes it very difficult to navigate wooded areas, which are abundant. We plan to set up camp near the original site, close enough to observe it. Then we found this. We arrived mid-afternoon and started documenting. This is the only photo I took on my phone of the scene. We weren't expecting to find this shit. A modern tent, obviously, very close to the original site. Hard to tell from the image, but I can describe it. The tent's poles are all snapped at least once, some in several places, as if they had been subjected to a lot of weight, like when someone leans on a tent and the poles crack or bend under the stress. The door flap seen below has been torn. The zipper beads or whatever they're called were bent. It was forced open. The material on the top is waterproof but still badly damaged and seems to have been soaking for a while. The inside of the tent has little in it apart from 2 sleeping bags, both of which are soaked through. No traces of much else. It has also been cut open, although we had no idea if it was from the inside or out. You already know what I think. The occupants left the tent when attacked. This photo was actually taken later on after we returned to our site. We found some of them soon after. The second tent, mostly unharmed, seems to have just succumbed to the elements. It was about 30 feet from the blue-gray tent in the previous picture. The body of a large male, maybe 40, wearing size 14 UK manufactured boots. His clothing and the area around his body was bloody. His boots were full of dried and frozen blood. He must have been bleeding while running here, and the blood pooled in his boots, as there is very little around. His neck had a large gash, his face and forehead smaller cuts. His arms and chest had cuts mostly on his left side. His legs were extremely shriveled, as if they had been subjected to extreme frostbite, unlike the rest of his body. He is wearing very good, high-quality clothing for cold weather. His ankles and legs are both broken. His feet are at odd angles. Body of a young woman, maybe 25 years old. She is very lightly clothed. Her body seems almost perfectly preserved. A lot of bruising, maybe frostbite related. She looks like she has only been dead maybe 3 days at most. Her body is cold to the touch, but she looked almost still alive. The word ash is carved into her arm. Her body is otherwise mostly unharmed. We took Geiger counter readings and found no trace of radiation at all, beyond background levels normal for higher elevations. We collected blood samples from both bodies, but had no way to test them. But their blood seemed completely normal for cold weather exposure. We were entirely unprepared for what we found. You have to understand, we were surprised when we saw a tent at all. Even surprised the Soviet recovery shit was still there. Of the occupants of the 2 tents, we only found 2 bodies. The 2 sleeping bags suggest at least twice that number for the 2 tents, it's reasonable to assume. We were understandably very unsettled. We made camp nearby, and every one of us checked our weapons. My Saiga had proven very unreliable when we test-fired them at altitude, so I put the thing back together twice, cleaning every part, keeping it as warm as I could. That night, we pretty much didn't sleep. 2 of us were watching outside. Every hour, 1 person went back inside our tent, and another left to take over, as we agreed. While I was trying to sleep, we all heard a very distinct snap over the sound of the wind. This isn't entirely unheard of, tree branches breaking off, but we were very edgy at the time. Maybe a bear, someone said. I don't remember who. That wasn't a good thing, but better than the alternative. Our group leader fired a shot into the air, hoping to scare off whatever it was. We didn't hear anything else after that. I managed to get to sleep at one point, but got woken up very soon after for me to take watch. While I was being shaken awake, we heard a sudden rise in the wind, and the tent buffeted like nuts. Then suddenly the wind, which had been a constant droning noise for hours, slowly died out. Within a minute, it was almost dead silence. For those of you who have never been hiking in this weather, this doesn't fucking happen. Everyone was now staring at each other, not sure if we were really hearing what we were. Someone from outside opened the tent and told us to come out. The moment he opened it, there was no wind. That's when my fucking heart froze. This was beyond abnormal. The Ural Mountains are a windy place this time of year. The wind doesn't just stop. We had high-powered flashlights. We sat in a group, peering into the dark around us. I kept looking back over the tent. I had this constant feeling of being snuck up on. Our group leader pointed his hunting rifle and looked down the scope, and we asked if he saw something. He said no, but soon we were all doing it. The minutes creeped by like hours, staring, sweating despite the cold, breathing and panting hard. We were terrified. We heard another snap, followed by more, tree branches snapping. There was no wind to snap them. We knew it was bad. The problem was you can't tell what direction those noises are coming from. They echo and seem to come from every direction. Someone fired their gun, and out of fear, I guess, someone yelled and shot at nothing. Everything went quiet again. We kept trying to figure out who had fired, but people didn't want to speak too loudly, so we couldn't figure it out. Then the most horrifying noise I have ever heard reached my ears. I can't decide how to describe it. It was an organic noise that sounded like a rasp, but also a screech. It was so unlike anything I had ever heard that at first I thought it was someone's phone. even though our phones had been turned off most of the trek. I realized something out there had made that noise. Then from behind the snowbank that the trees had formed, we saw snow trailing down as something pale white crossed it slowly. I got little to no look at it. We started shooting at the thing, and I couldn't see much over the muzzle flare. For the next minute, I forgot everything. I only remember how slowly they moved. They seemed to move slowly but with purpose. Gunfire did nothing. I unloaded my Saiga into one as it got close before I turned and ran. I was right that they had snuck up on us. 3 of them were almost right behind the tent. I ran into one and it grabbed me. It held me and I felt something sharp dig into my arm. I didn't look at it. I tore away and felt my arm start burning. I felt like my arm had been torn off. I ran for hours. When you need to, your body will make you run and keep running. There is nothing that will stop you when you are in flight mode. I crossed a lot of ground. I became lost. I didn't have any equipment for navigation. I fell to the ground against a tree and convinced myself I was going to die, and over the next few hours came to terms with that. I was still carrying the shotgun, but it was empty. I had shells in my pocket, but I was too exhausted to load it. When I woke up, it was around midday. I loaded my gun and was amazed I was alive. I had to clean the gun out. It was caked in snow. I wanted to go back, but wasn't sure if I could. I spent a lot of the day trying to hunt something. I managed to shoot at a rabbit and miss it. Eventually, I decided to go back to the site. Better than starving to death, I assumed. Everything was damaged or destroyed. I grabbed what I could and left. I didn't want to stay longer than I had to. They're still there, unburied. I had to run. When I got back to a small town we'd set out from, I told them a bear attack had killed everyone. I was the only survivor. People seemed to believe me when I showed them the gash in my arm. It took 3 days to get some money wired to me so I could get a plane home. I found my phone in my pocket while I was sitting in the back of the plane, bandages covering my whole shoulder. If I hadn't had these pictures, it would all have been for nothing. This is all that's left of what we did. My friends are dead. Don't let them be dead for nothing. I am currently negotiating a deal on a business loan. I'm going to use the money to hire some mercenaries to come up there with me and get them so we can bury the bodies. My friends aren't going to lie there frozen and afraid. I want them to have the burial they deserve. I just want to say in advance, yes, this is all real. Beyond these photos, there's nothing more I can use to prove it to you. What I did was technically illegal, and I could be tried for military trespass. I don't feel like getting passed around in a Russian military prison. I have friends I need to bury, but I also have to tell someone. This site is both non-credible enough that I can post here, but as I stated, I suspect that among you are a few who can use this information.
This was back in 2008. I was hiking in eastern Finland and western Russia, just a short 100-kilometer route through absolutely nothing. I started from Petkaljärvi National Park, hiked along the border, and crossed to Sovietland at a crossing south of Kanuka. Just forest and not a soul around. It was early fall, so the nature was tremendously beautiful. I was making my way through virtually untouched wilderness. On the Finnish side, there was nothing particularly interesting. After crossing and getting to the Russian Outback, it was great. I had walked for about 4 hours after the crossing, and I came to a beautiful lakeshore with birch trees and mossy ground. I set up camp and went looking for suitable firewood. I circled around the camp and got further and further into the birch grove. I found a neat clearing that didn't appear to have any trees ever growing in it, since the ground was so smooth. In the middle of the clearing stood a really big rock. It didn't look man-made, but as I got closer it stated to look odd. The surface of the rock was quite smooth, but I could make out some marks that I can only suppose were carvings. It wouldn't have been the first monolith with carvings on it that I've come across. There's quite a few of them scattered around Karelia. I did notice some vegetation on top of the rock, which I thought was strange, as it appeared to be a roughly egg-shaped chunk of rock. For some unknown reason, I had the idea to climb on top of the rock. With a bit of effort, I climbed on top of it, and what do you know? There's at least 30 centimeters worth of moss growing there. The top of the rock wasn't what I expected. In fact, it formed a rough bowl shape, which had grown full of moss. Some brainworm told me to see if there's something under the moss. So I started ripping the moist growths open and unearthed the coolest thing I've ever found. Under the moss, I uncovered a clearly hand-carved bowl shape, the remains of a flintstone that had clearly been worked by human hands and what I identified as bone fragments. With a bit of detective work, I managed to find a handful of flintstone chips and another handful of really very brittle bone fragments. They had to be animal bones, they were so small. I had stumbled across what I can only assume is a very old place of worship. Russia had a strong tradition of pagan magic and superstition in the pre-industrial era, so the spot could have been used only a few hundred years earlier. I doubt at Stone Age the landscape would have changed too much. I was fascinated by my discovery, and I decided to put the moss I had torn out back in its place. I felt very calm and peaceful in that clearing. It was like a temple.
There was a grove of trees near my middle school that everyone called the Woods. It had a long rope swing that me and a few of my friends used to play around on. It was pretty secluded, even being about quarter of a mile from school, the neighborhood. Once, when I was 13, I was dicking around the swing when I spotted something. Turns out there was a dog tag, the kind that would have literally belonged to a dog, not a soldier, nailed to one of the trees with the name Europa and a phone number on it. Curious, I called it. Someone picked up pretty fast, but there was just heavy breathing on the end of the line for around 30 seconds. I was about to hang up when this heavy, gravelly voice spoke up. At first, I was too shocked to say anything. I hadn't expected anyone to answer, or was hoping the line was dead, or something. The other end was difficult to make out through the static on the line, but the sound of the voice made the hairs on my arms stand up as soon as I heard it, even though it took me a moment to make out what it was saying. "Did you touch it?" Now, it didn't much sound like a question, but for some reason I felt like I had to come up with an answer. The idea of not answering didn't even cross my mind, despite the fact that I had no clue what the other person wanted. It wasn't until I tried to talk that I realized how terrified I was, but I managed to stutter out a quick, "No." I can't say what scared me so bad about the call. Maybe just the fact that I was 13 and alone, easily a quarter of a mile from anyone else, or that I felt like I was violating something by calling the number. Couldn't really say what I felt like I was violating, but it felt like it nonetheless. There was a sharp inhale on the other end of the line, then terrifying, unhinged laughter. The other end started to say something, but I hung up and booked it home before that. A restricted number called me later that night, which was weird because blocked numbers usually read as unknown caller on that phone, and left a message. When I got the courage to listen to it with a friend a few days later, it was just the same laughter I'd hung up and a chant of, "You shouldn't have done that," by what sounded like 5 or 6 different hollow, unsettling voices. Unlike the phone call, the message was crystal clear. I deleted that shit with the force of a wrathful god and refused to touch my phone for the rest of the day. I'd occasionally get calls from a restricted number after that, but I'd never answer them. Luckily, that phone broke before the end of the year, so I got a new one, with a new number. Since getting a new phone, it's never happened again. The dog tag was still there when I went back to the grove with my friends a few days later. I'm pretty sure it was there until they cut down the grove to make way for a huge dog park, baseball field a few years back actually. Never heard of anyone else trying to call the number though. TLDR. I found a dog tag with a number on it nailed to a tree, called the number, and was answered by heavy breathing and manic laughter. In retrospect, there's basically no way it wasn't just some older kids messing with me or whoever else hung out around in the grove, but thinking about it still kind of terrifies me. As breaking news to no one anywhere, I'm a huge fucking wuss.
I also have a cult wood story that happened in Russia and should be 100% true. You can even try Googling it. There is a big ass LARP happening in some woods of Russia. There is a group of 7 people who play Crusaders or whatever at the LARP, so they have mail or plate armor, metal helmets and all. They arrive early on in the forest, so they decide just to chill and scout around. While walking in the forest, they hear singing or chanting nearby. The Crusaders remain silent and decide to sneak in and check it out. They see some people in black robes in the middle of a symbol, holding a knife above a cat that is being held down. Obviously, some sacrificing is going on. The Crusaders have an idea to save the cat. They surround the cultists and suddenly burst out of the woods. One guy in shining plate armor screams, "In God's name, stop, you blasphemous Satanist pigs!" They charge the cultists fast, yes, with buffered swords. Cultists are terrified and run away. They manage to catch at least one. He starts crying. Don't remember exactly how many they did catch. Turns out some sweaty, edgy teens were try-hard, fake, Satanist, attempting to sacrifice a cat with trembling hands. Imagine the surprise in those teens when they saw these Crusaders burst out of the bushes in the middle of a fucking random Russian forest. I mean, what are the chances?
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check the Odyssey and Rumble pages for separate archives of previous broadcasts.